People still talk about FDR's first 100 days, even though it was more than 80 years ago. But his last 100 days, arguably, were just as fascinating and even eventful. President Roosevelt's health, it was failing, but he still achieved some incredible things to start his unprecedented fourth term. Well, there's a new book called The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and at Peace, and it gives you an inside look at what was going on at the time. I recently sat down with its author, David Woolner. He is also a senior fellow and resident historian of the Roosevelt Institute and professor of history at Marist College. David, as always, good to talk to you about one of our more favorite subjects. And it's funny, given how much you've dedicated your life to the history of this president and his presidency, even you learned new things this time around, didn't you, about that?
Absolutely. You always learn new things, especially about FDR. You know, he didn't always put his cards on the table.
In fact, what was that famous line? He would always the right and the left hand.
Right. He once told a group of visiting foreign policy specialists that he was a juggler. You know, he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing.
Well, to that unpredictability, when history looks through the prism, everybody knows the first 100 days, what he inherited, which was a nation in crisis, and how he reshaped this country with ambitious and dramatic proposals and even policies. But this book really focuses on the last 100 days of his life and his presidency. Let's first set the stage. Where were we as a country in 1945?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you know, part of why I think this period is so important, and interestingly enough, the first 100 days actually dates from the first day that Congress goes into session, not the actual presidency, but the Congress. And in truth, the book covers the last 100 days. When the gavel came down on January 3rd, 1945, it was exactly 100 days later that FDR died. So from that perspective, the book is actually accurate. The country was in an uncertain mood. You know, we forget that there was tremendous weariness about the Second World War. People thought that the war would be over by Christmas. You know, we had swept across northern France in the summer of 1944. It wasn't over. We weren't into Germany, and there was the Battle of the Bulge had broken out, the tremendous counteroffensive that Hitler's forces launched on the Western Front. Casualty rates in Europe were skyrocketing. There was a manpower crisis. You know, General Marshall was fearful that they weren't going to have the troops they needed to make their way into Germany. It was serious. And Congress, unlike 1933, convened in kind of a somber frame of mind. There was also great awareness that there were huge differences between us and the Russians, and most Americans don't realize this, but also between us and the British. The British had gone into Greece in late 1944 to essentially take over the country because there was a communist insurgency. The Greek communists were allies of the British and the Americans in the Second World War. But once the Nazis had left, the British intervened to kind of put a conservative regime in place. And this was very unpopular among the American press and among the American people. So it wasn't just what are the Russians up to, but are we going to see a return to British imperialism once this war is over?
And FDR physically, you know, talk about how long at this point he'd been in office, for the condition of his health and also mood.
Yeah, you know, Roosevelt was exhausted. He had been in office now for 12 years. He's a man who had obviously contracted poliomyelitis when he was 39 years old. He was a heavy smoker, or was a consistent smoker. He had cut down his smoking by this point, but he still was smoking. So he was in a precarious state of health, and he'd been ordered by his doctors, believe it or not, to work 4 hours a day. Yeah, right. So the guy is going to, run the country and run a global war on 4 hours a day. Obviously, he ignores this advice, and they're sort of frantically trying to get him to rest all the time. And he does, occasionally step back and try to get some rest. But generally speaking, there's no way he can keep to this routine.
Does he know that the specter of a fourth term and everything it brought along with it? Does he feel the sheer exhaustion as well, and wonder also, is he equipped in this physical state, especially how much the country knew of his physical state too, to handle the rigors of what laid ahead?
It's interesting. It's a very good question. The truth is that people were aware that he had a health problem. The American people understood that he'd had polio and they had difficulty walking and so forth. They didn't realize the extent to his disability, and they didn't realize that he used a wheelchair. You know, he never allowed that to be seen in public. But what they didn't know, what was probably much more serious, was the state of his health. In the spring of 1944, a team of doctors discovered that he had developed congestive heart failure. You know, he was in serious health problems. And his daughter was worried, Eleanor was worried, the people close around him were worried. And you could tell. I mean, he goes on digitalis, the medication to keep his blood pressure under control, and it gives him a kind of that gray pallor that you see. And so the public picks up on this. There are photographs that he looks different. He looks thinner. And so during the election in 1944, which, by the way, he called the most bitter election of the four that he ran, you know, Dewey himself doesn't bring it up, but there's all kinds of whispering campaigns about his health. And there are headlines: a vote for Roosevelt's a vote for Truman. You know, we have the right to know what the president's health is. You know, so it was an issue. What's fascinating about this, though, is that Roosevelt himself, you know, he was kind of ambivalent, to say the least, about running. I think he felt the responsibility of office, that he had to finish the war. He wanted to finish the war, so there's definitely some of his own ego involved. But, you know, as he famously said in July of 1944, all that is within me cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River, and he meant it. So it's a fascinating period. On the one hand, he wants to run. On the other hand, he wrote to one friend, I won't cry if I lose this election. He'd be happy to go back to Hyde Park and you know, take up his retirement.
And there was a lot beyond just the war in his legacy. In many ways, it was bookended. The New Deal, sure, enacted, but in terms of enforced and fully utilized. Talk about some of the things that lay in front of him, and also things like the UN, for example, and whether or not Israel would become a formalized state, et cetera. So on the global level and then also domestically, his policies hadn't been fully cemented yet, had they?
No, and it's interesting. What's really telling about Franklin Roosevelt is not so much 1944, but 1940. That is the year that he decides to make the unprecedented third-term run. That is the year that he picks Henry Wallace, the most left-wing and most dedicated New Dealer of all the potential candidates for vice president, to be his running mate. And he does so, and this is not known, and this is in the book, he does so because he says a man like me could drop dead at any time. And he was thinking about the New Deal and the legacy. In 1944, he's just too tired. And it's interesting, he's worried about the U.S. Senate and whether or not they will support the Atlantic Charter. So he doesn't want to fight over, what many in the Democratic Party consider too radical a candidate, too left-wing a candidate. He picks Truman, somebody safe, because the last thing he wants is a political fight over his vice presidency in the Senate in particular, when he needs that Senate to ratify the UN Charter in some time in 1945. So he kind of picks a more conservative, and he gives a very interesting press conference where at the beginning of his fourth term, where he says, my political views are a little left of center. So he's trying to reassure, and Eleanor's actually upset. The undersecretaries that he appoints for the State Department are pretty conservative guys, and she says to him privately in a letter, what's the difference between this and Dewey? So it's very interesting. He's, again, playing that political game right up till the end. But on the other hand, he is worried about the New Deal, and he is worried about the famous 1944 Economic Bill of Rights speech. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made. I mean, that line just says it all right there. So he was, again, in the book, there are lots of initiatives that never get fulfilled because, of course, he dies. One of them was full employment. One of them was a guaranteed annual wage. He wanted the first conference of the United Nations to be a World Conservation Conference. It's a fascinating story because he's juggling all these ideas, but his main focus is establishing the United Nations. And of course, again, his critics will say this is kind of pie in the sky, left-wing stuff, No, Roosevelt's United Nations was steeped in realpolitik. He knows that there's not going to be any peace in the world if the Russians, the Americans, the British and the Chinese don't get along, the so-called four policemen. So the whole structure of the institution is designed around these great powers. It's really kind of a room where the great powers are going to be able to hash out their differences. So we won't have another war. Obviously the French are going to be, invited in at the last minute, probably out of sheer ego on the part of de Gaulle. He wants to be at the table. But it's a fascinating story, and one that's really kind of, in many ways quite moving, because he's tired, he's exhausted, and yet he's determined. It's another thing he says in 1940, it comes out in the book. I don't want to give too much away. But, there's this wonderful conversation between Eleanor and a friend where she says, he knew in 1940 that keeping on in office could shorten his life. And he decided to go ahead, and I think he's right.
When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with David Woolner. We're going to talk about World War II as it's winding down. The president, he's warning about poverty at home, concerns of fascism, and how they're threats to democracy, at least one of his most famous speeches.